Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this Techstrong learning experience brought to you by Cloud Native Now. My name is Cody, and I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel ahead. Before we get things kicked off, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes to review. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend. The on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude this live session today. Now, if you'd like to engage with us today, there are a couple of options to do so. The first of which is the chat tab, which you'll find on the right side of your screen. I'd like you to start testing out that function for me right now by letting us know from where you are joining us today. I do know we have a global audience. Now, if you do have any specific questions you would like us to discuss on the air, go ahead and send those into the Q&A box. It just helps us to keep track of those and make sure we hit them whenever we can. And of course, before we close out today, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of our program. The topic of our discussion today is Kubernetes in the enterprise. And I'm joined by a full roundtable today. We have Maz Tamadan, Director of Product and Solution Marketing at Kasten by Veeam, Frank J. Olhorst, Editor-at-Large, Mustafa Radwan, Principal at Road Clouds, Alex Nada, CTO at Noble9, Danielle Cook, Co-Chair of the CNCF Cartographos Working Group and VP at Fairwinds. And keeping us on track today, we have our very own Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer at Techstrong Group. To our entire panel, thank you so much for joining us today on Techstrong Learning. Mike, do you want to go ahead and get this train rolling?
All right, thanks, Cody. I guess one of the issues that we're seeing today is the good news is Kubernetes has crossed the proverbial chasm, but it's doing so in a way that might arguably, at least from my perspective, is a little messy, shall we say. We're seeing people are running multiple distributions of Kubernetes. They don't seem to want to upgrade them for reasons we'll jump into in a minute. And they're also running version numbers that go as far back as, I don't know, I've seen 1.12 still running. And I know we were just talking about 1.27 earlier this month. Danielle, you guys see a lot of customers. What are you seeing amongst folks and where are they on this journey?
Well, I think the maturity varies. So, organizations are, and lots of enterprises are super sophisticated. So you have the Adobes, the Wayfairs, the Boeings, they're doing all the cool things. They're, creating projects themselves. Intuit did that with Argo, and that's awesome. But then you have a lot of organizations that are just starting out, they're dipping their toes in the water, or they've got one or two applications containerized using Kubernetes, and they're not advancing or they're not moving fast enough. So this cloud native maturity is all over the place. And like you said, people are not necessarily upgrading to the latest versions because they don't know, what APIs have been deprecated. They're just not sure of where to go. So I think it's all over the place, like you said.
Alex, are you seeing the same thing? I mean, or is there slightly, what did the man say? The future is here. It's just unevenly distributed.
It's definitely unevenly distributed. One of the things I would say is that our customers who move fairly quickly tend to redo their clusters at least once a year, like whole new version. Hey, we made the new platform, right? And they're upgrading things like they're changing not just core versions of Kubernetes and add-ons and things like that, but also maybe changing their observability round or changing their security features, et cetera. A lot of enterprises want to move slower, have more stability than that. And they might be making wholesale changes more like every 2 years, every 3 years to how they host. And in that case, they are facing doing upgrades. Mm-hmm. And I think it can be difficult to manage that given the complexity. You run a couple add-ons and, there's dependencies in there. It can become kind of brittle. We're seeing that challenge across.
Maz, what are you seeing? One of the things that came through last week when I was at KubeCon Europe is people were saying, hey, provisioning Kubernetes itself is easy. It's all the stuff on top that's gotten hard. So what are you guys seeing?
Yes, thank you, Mike. Yes, I was there too, and it was pretty apparent to me. It's my fourth KubeCon, so I could see the shift from early adopters in past KubeCons to more of a mainstream practitioners. So we are kind of, in the terms of maturity, we are moving along, and we are definitely, in my mind, past the early adoption phase. And we are getting into the mainstream, which is where the bulk of the folks would be. So, and where the enterprise adoption would probably be more apparent by the nature of Kubernetes, and history of where it's coming from.
All right. Mustafa, welcome to the event. What are you seeing from folks? I mean, where are they struggling?
Yeah, as Daniel pointed out, the maturity is all over the place. So some are actually very good when they start. They have a vision and a strategy where we want to go with this, and they are willing to fail a couple of times at the first, and they follow the path, crawl, walk, and run. And usually those end up doing well over time because they know it's a journey and they have to go through the maturity. I think Daniel helped, thank you, with the CNCF to put together the maturity model. That's a great starting point and the pathway for many enterprises to follow. Others are just, we have a cluster here, cluster there, and then they end up in a situation, which I see most of the time, they're gonna need a U-turn because we need to figure out where we're gonna go with this, how can we plan it, and how can we move forward with it. Or they actually shy away from Kubernetes, unfortunately. There are success and failure stories today.
All right. Well, because we want to encourage this behavior, let's take a question from the audience right away. Frank, I'm going to kick this to you. Do we need a higher level of abstraction to manage Kubernetes? Because it's supposed to be a platform for building platforms, but there's no standard control plane. There's everybody's got a different kind of framework for using this thing. And are we at the point where maybe, I don't know, do I always have to be a software engineer and a DevOps expert to manage this thing, or can mere mortal IT folks with your basic IDLE certification start playing?
Well, it's a challenge. And one of the biggest reasons why it's a challenge is because not only because of the inherent complexity, but also because of the amount of knowledge that's needed to work in a Kubernetes environment or with the platform today, because there's so many different ways and flavors and ways to do it. So, we're moving towards a way that, maturity is coming into the platform that should make it easier. And, once we get to that point in time, once we have this standardized way of managing it, deploying, and upgrading, it's going to get a lot easier. But I don't see that happening for some time. I mean, right now, we take a look at, the use of Kubernetes in the enterprise. And the Cloud Native Computing Foundation says that 91% of the enterprises use Kubernetes in production. But we have no statistic on how many percent are using it successfully or are happy with it. And I think that's where the challenge lies. It's going to be a combination of education and standardization.
Well, and we don't know, Frank, if that's just one application at a huge enterprise that's using it in production, or if it's widespread.
Yes, that's very true.
Yeah. Also, it depends on probably how you want to use the technology and what level. Like if you already have a very large software expertise and software team in place, you can and want to sometimes have a tight control of the whole value chain. So you bring your own Kubernetes basically, and you manage it, you sustain it, and you update it and maintain it. Or if you don't have that, you might want to go with a managed Kubernetes service. And so you're still using Kubernetes, except that you're not running it. And so it depends on how you want to, at what level you want to come in, right? Based on the expertise you have or not, or how much far or how much tighter control you want to have across the whole value chain.
Well,
one of the other interesting things about creating another abstraction layer is that you're kind of getting away from, how you want a Kubernetes system to work. You're kind of getting to the point where, all right, we're going to add how many more layers to the stack so that we can use a particular tool. We might as well go back to virtualization completely at that point in time.
Well, let's just jump into this other question since we're kind of floating down the same topic. But a lot of folks are I guess, Mustafa, we'll start with you. Is the issue that it's just too powerful and there's too many bells and whistles? And do I need to kind of reduce the number of things that I let people play with and the knobs and put guardrails in place and say, this is going to be our standard implementation, and ignore all those other stuff and just turn off those features? What are people doing to kind of get their feet wet and get started with this whole thing?
Yeah, great question, Mike. The thing I personally advocate for, at least at the very beginning, is to keep it simple and small. If you're just getting started and you don't have that Kubernetes experience or muscles, I would call them, just start simple and small, and then you can always go and take advantage of those add-ons and extensive features of Kubernetes, and following the crawl, walk, and run kind of principle.
Well, that brings us to a topic that Alex was talking about before we came on the air. But originally, we were supposed to have a handful of large clusters that everybody was going to share, and then it turns out that everybody gets started with a small cluster, and now we're starting to talk about fleets of Kubernetes clusters to manage. And is that part of the problem? There's the issue that we have too many clusters, or we just don't have a way to manage it in the first place. And should we consolidate these things? Alex, what do you think?
I do see the trend for smaller clusters or for application level clusters. And I think it's partly because Kubernetes has capabilities that maybe we traditionally consider part of an application server. It can see a lot of the workload and control a lot of the workload, right? But I don't see it inherently as a problem that, if organizations choose to manage Kubernetes at an application level. I guess I would say it depends more on what they're actually doing to manage those workloads, right? Let me put it this way. I think what I see among my customers is that new workloads moving onto Kubernetes are outpacing migrated workloads moving onto Kubernetes. And those applications can get big just in one cluster. And so I think that's just kind of a natural progression, and not all clusters are created equal. That's why I think it's important to have a good measure on how well it's working for you so you can iterate on it.
All right. Danielle, Alex brings up a good point. Are you seeing a lot of brand new applications, or are people trying to migrate stuff to Kubernetes? And is that even advisable given, refactoring and replatforming, at least in my experience, is one of those career limiting decisions?
There's the organizations that are born in the cloud, right? They are cloud native all the way. They started there. And then, of course, we have more traditional applications and they're trying to move. And I think the benefits are there. It's just a lot of decision making. And that's where you have your platform engineering. You have to have that core team, and they have to create a paved road for the users so that when they are migrating applications, it's not just do whatever you want and let's see what happens. It's, hey, we've created this Kubernetes platform. We've plugged in the guardrails. We put all the security in place, and you're just on this road. And I know a lot of people are talking about it as the internal developer platform, right? Letting developers use Kubernetes the way they should, with safety nets, but still with enough flexibility that you're getting the benefits of Kubernetes. And I think that's where enterprises are more successful when they put that in place.
Yeah. Mustafa, are developers still somewhat intimidated by Kubernetes, and are we asking them to know too much about the platform? And last time I counted, there was maybe 7 million developers that know something about Kubernetes, and that doesn't mean they're hardly proficient, but that's out of a base of, 50 to 60 million. So do we need to make this simpler, or do developers ever need to know anything about Kubernetes, and we're just making it too hard for them in the first place?
I would say they just need to know enough to just get by and get their applications deployed. We should abstract away, or at least simplify to them all that's related to deployments and infrastructure, all that stuff. As Daniel pointed out, the internal development developed platforms or center of excellence, whatever you want to call it, a centralized team can take care of all the heavy lifting for you. So we can always reach out to them if we don't know. They handle all the communications behind the scenes with compliance, security, you name it. As a developer, I containerize my app. I know the ins and outs of it. I deploy it, and then that's it for me. I can monitor, look at some metrics here and there, but I shouldn't dig deeper and look at, tons of YAML files. And that's something we'll see in the future. AI can help us with automate the YAML, which is the language of Kubernetes. But we have to deal with writing lots of YAML today for developers, unless you offload this to a centralized team.
Yeah.
Alex, you want to jump in there? Because you deal with observability and you talk about shift left, and you guys are trying to do manage service level objectives as code, but I'm confronted with a wall of YAML files. This is no joy in Mudville. So, walk me through what's the trade-off.
I think part of it is, you mentioned platform engineering as a piece of this, and I think that's an important piece of it. But at the same time, what I hear from Mustafa is like, as an application team, as an application leader, a service owner, I want to be able to deploy onto the platform, and the platform should give me something, right? And I think these two things are complementary. DevOps being sort of like, a practice in which you build it, you run it, but you don't have to run it completely alone because you have a platform team that's there and tells you, if you stick within this rubric, you can get all these great things like observability and management tools, and you can get security tools, and you can get maybe cost management and FinOps tools, et cetera. What we're seeing that our customers are asking us for most is tools to manage it, to measure it. They have an appetite to experiment. They want to try new observability techniques. They want to try techniques related to all of those things I just mentioned. What they need is a way to tell if it's moving the needle. And I guess the way I would put it is they need to know what the needle is. Like, what was I trying to do again? I'm trying to achieve better adherence to my SLO, my SLA, maybe it is. They want to make sure that they're achieving good metrics and adherence to their security policies, and also that they're within reasonable cost. And SLOs, among other observability techniques, help them do exactly that. Allow them some space to experiment.
All right, Danielle, we have a question here that's talking about day 1 versus day 2 and day 3. It seems to me that a lot of folks are like so zoned in on just trying to get the thing up and running that, they don't consider that day 2 and day 3 is when I wake up and there's 6 layers of things sitting on Kubernetes that are more complex than Kubernetes is. So do folks really know what they're getting involved in, and do they have a plan? And maybe that's who should be like walking them through this?
Well, I think that's where the cloud native maturity model comes into place. Like, we know, I can go to EKS and I can get, Kubernetes running today, easy. That's no problem. But it is a challenge day 2, day 3. What are you actually doing with it? So with the working group that I'm part of with the CNCF, like, we created this model based on end users' experiences and what they were doing. And there's 5 stages of maturity. And so if you use that as a guidepost, it says, okay, when you get to level 2, where you're going to be running applications in production, here's all the things you need to have decided and you need to be thinking through. And when you get to level 3, this is when you revisit some of those decisions, and this is what you need to consider. It doesn't necessarily say use this product, use this open source project that the CNCF has, but it's that guidance. And I think a lot of organizations are out there trying to understand the guidance, like trying to get help with this.
All right. That is one of the scariest documents you will ever look at, is the CNCF landscape document. So be careful, look at it with some caution and don't completely flip out when you see it. Maz, we are also talking to a lot of folks who are deploying stateful applications now, and there's been a long-running debate between stateful and stateless that goes, since the first cluster ever came out.
Right.
However, we're also seeing that as a practical matter, not everybody data has to be stored somewhere. It's stateless. It's either outside the cluster or in the cluster. Not everybody has a place outside. So by definition, we're going to see databases on the cluster. Is that more complex than Kubernetes itself? What does that add to the mix and the conversation that people should be aware of?
I think it's part of it, right? As you pointed out, very initially, early days of Kubernetes, it was primarily focused on truly stateless applications. But we have clearly moved way beyond that And we are seeing emergence of a lot of stateful applications, especially enterprise level. And when you talk about enterprise workloads, you talk about databases, as you pointed out, right? They have to store information about customers, prospect, you name it, products in some kind of database. And they could be not only one, but many databases they have to deal with. So all of a sudden, the workload the application in Kubernetes that you are trying to deploy has many, many, many different data sets within the cluster and outside the cluster. And to be able to protect the application and make sure it's running and can keep running if there's a hiccup somewhere, it's becoming complex. And the complexity is not necessarily a function of Kubernetes; it's a function of the workload, right? The things are different, but at the end of the day, a critical mission critical application has to be resilient enough to weather some issues, right? So in the Kubernetes space, in cloud native architecture, you need to account for all the different pieces and artifacts and secrets and config maps and you name it that the application needs to be able to recover should something happen, ransomware attacks or some outage somewhere. They have to be able to come back up, and that's the complexity of implementing that. But it's not really tied to Kubernetes itself, I would say. It's just a function or byproduct of how we are doing business in cloud native world.
So, Frank, is that where we're at? I mean, Kubernetes is simple. It's just all the other crap that's hard.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, let's look at it from this stateful versus stateless applications point of view. Stateless applications are a lot more easier to manage, scale, deploy, and do whatever you want with when it comes down to it. So Kubernetes doesn't really get in the way with stateless applications. It's when you start moving to these stateful applications where you have to worry about that persistent access to data, and you have to worry about certain things such as how you can keep those applications updated consistently. And that's where it gets a lot more complex with Kubernetes, because you have to take into account many more, moving pieces. Now, the real question comes down to if you're moving a legacy application up to the cloud, or if you're writing from scratch, or, just working from a cloud native perspective, can a stateless application do what you need? And can you use that to meet your needs, or do you have to go with a stateful application? And I think that becomes one of the first, decisions, because what you move into, especially with Kubernetes deployments, they might be easy to deploy, or there might be tools to help you deploy them and monitor them, but there's a large lack of skills when it comes to troubleshooting. It's not how something works when it works that's important, it's how it works when it doesn't work that becomes important at that point in time.
Yeah. Mustafa, are we kind of maybe becoming fashion victims here in this sense? I mean, now Kubernetes, it's cool. It's the great new shiny object, as one of our attendees points to. But I have to wonder, are all the applications that are showing up in Kubernetes really fit for purpose, or now people are just resume padding, and maybe there's a lot of things that shouldn't be on Kubernetes in the first place because they can run somewhere else better? So what's your sense of or advice for how do I really assess an application's fitness for Kubernetes?
Yeah, great question, Mike. So certainly Kubernetes is not for every organization or team. First, if you understand where Kubernetes came from another project called Borg at Google, right? Where it's a container first, cloud first kind of organization running massive amount of workloads. So if I take Kubernetes and give it to a team of 10 people, maybe that is not a good fit for them, unless they're all really skilled in Kubernetes, ran multiple clusters, and day two, day one operation, day one and day two for clusters. So first off, you look at it as a spectrum. You start with the stateless apps, and then gradually you can get the stateful apps. There are many things support you today for running stateful apps. For example, if you run NoSQL databases, there are operators, you have storage drivers, and there are Kubernetes features itself that support stateful apps. And there are some stateful apps that are not going to run in Kubernetes, no matter what we do for now. You're going to continue to work where they are and integrate and interact with other Kubernetes apps in the cluster.
Do you see that your customers and your contacts are adopting Kubernetes because of some workload? Are they doing it more strategically? I was pushed onto Kubernetes by a weird, I like to call it a weird but awesome workload. Maybe, I don't know, 7 years ago. But like, is it those applications that are pushing the adoption, or is it more the high degree of automation, the ability to version control everything, and everything is code and the entire deployment is repeatable, that's pushing people onto the platform?
I think it's deeper than that. Okay, go ahead, Mustafa, first. Go ahead.
I would say it's for the declarative infrastructure, Alex. So having everything in YAML, this is going to make us modernize our infrastructure apps and make us, ready, kind of future ready. But what type of issues are this going to create for me? What are the side effects? That we're going to discuss. We're going to figure out later.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's deeper than that in a way, because I mean, what's happening at the core of it, and what we see is that there is this trend, application modernization. It's happening because people are trying to get, in a way, to cloudify their IT operations, but in a right way, not just because they want to go to the cloud. They just want to use the cloud and leverage the cloud the right way. So they started, moving, lift and shift their application over to the cloud, and that went to some degree, but you don't really get the benefit of the cloud, the flexibility, the agility of the cloud if you don't re-architect or refactor your application. As long as you agree to do that and you get to a point where you say, well, yeah, I'm in the cloud somehow, but I want to really get the true benefits of that, and you need to redesign my application. When you get to that point, there is not a lot of choice. You don't want to go create something on the side brand new. You have a tailor-made cloud native architecture based on containers, microservices, and of course Kubernetes in front of you, used by this vast community of people. It may be overwhelming, complex, but that's pretty much the only game in town at this point of time. If you want to refactor your application, or if you're born in the cloud and you're starting from scratch, a brand new business model, then you also have your choice to make. Do I design it using VMs, or do I design it in containers? I would submit the choice is clear. It's not really a choice anymore. People are going to go to cloud native and go implement microservices and package them in containers and have them run and be orchestrated by Kubernetes. So that's why what's fueling the momentum behind Kubernetes. That's what the core trend is, and which I would submit is a lot deeper than one application or a strategic decision made by someone in IT to go over and grab Kubernetes because it's a buzzword.
Mm-hmm. Maz, I don't know how common this is, but there's one person here who wants to know or looking for advice on how do I move from bare metal to Kubernetes, because it seems like they have workloads where developers are probably didn't want to pay for the, what do we call it, the virtual machine tax on the application to begin with. So now they're hesitant about Kubernetes. I don't know. Some people argue the virtualization tax doesn't really exist. Other people say it does. It's kind of in the mind of the beholder. What's your advice to folks on that score?
Well, in this case, the way I say it is that we are talking really legacy applications that are running on an actual servers, bare metal servers, right? So this is really legacy applications. There is no way you can lift and shift this into the cloud, or at least try to benefit from the cloud model in terms of agility, flexibility, and cost. So there is really no way for those folks without really sitting down and decide what to do with the application, right? Either change it, meaning themselves refactor it if they have the whereabouts to do that, the software expertise, and still the team around it, which may not be the case anymore. They may have been in maintenance mode for a long time and may have lost their developers for that. Or they can just go and find a commercial solution for what they wanted to do. They are not in the business of, I guess, software development necessarily, right? They have a core logic, a core business model that they have to go to. They might find a solution, a commercial solution for what they need to do. That could be already cloud native in a way. But they have to change, meaning they have to either refactor the application themselves or find a solution that would match their requirements and do what they need to do that is commercially available. I don't really see a lot of solution for them except taking there's a groundwork to do, and it's a heavy investment, and some people say it's a risky investment, but no risk, no reward. There is, if you want to get to the cloud in the right way, you have to refactor or create or design from scratch.
So it kind of comes down to that there's no tax shelter for technical debt.
It's a nice way to say it. Yeah, it's a nice way to say it.
All right. Danielle, I think we have somehow or other successfully turned some of our attendees into true believers in managed services based on their questions. But now they're trying to figure out, well, there seems to be no shortage of choices when it comes to managed services. And I know you guys are in that business, but what differentiates, when do I decide to go with what type of managed service? Each cloud service provider has one. There's independence. There's no shortage. So what should people be looking for? How to navigate that whole choice?
Well, I think the first thing is deciding that you want to do that in the first place, right? So, you can have your internal team all spend time managing Kubernetes, but in most cases, that's not what you're selling, right? That's not the application you're trying to get to market. So using a managed service does make a lot of sense. Deciding who, I mean, that is up to the organization. It's, yes, you can go with the Googles and the Azures, and that's they're going to have their prepackaged tools. You're going to use those. You're going to be able to get to market. But then there's organizations, Fairwinds, we have software and services, but we have, expertise across all the cloud vendors, expertise in, different open source tools. So I think it's about your comfort level of, do you want experts in everything? Are you just a GKE house? And that's really going to help you decide to make the decision.
I want to just add one thing to this, and I really agree with Danielle, but a lot of customers we see are making the strategic choice of having at least 2 public cloud vendors involved, because they don't want to put everything into one basket, and they want to be able to have some kind of or at least best of breed type of choices, where they can maybe have, I don't know, some AI workloads on Google and some other more traditional, OLTP workloads on AWS or things like that. But they want to have multiple cloud vendors. The multi-cloud outcome is really, I believe, what's happening in the marketplace, because they don't want to be tied to one, at least for business reasons, because they beside the technology, there's also the business angle of pricing and things that you have to factor into your decision making of which partners you want to go with. But we have seen a lot of our customers having at least 2, if not more, cloud vendors involved, for specifically and intentionally so.
I just want to be clear. Are you suggesting that cloud services occasionally fail and maybe we need a backup plan? Is that where that's going? Because I'd be shocked.
No, that could happen, but that was not my point. My point was more about having choices from a business perspective. If you put all your eggs into one basket and something is not, the relationship sours for some reason, then it's hard to move around. But if you have different players already and you can sort of check them against each other, and that would be probably a better stance vis-a-vis the cloud providers that you're using.
As someone who at this point professionally measures downtime, yes, they do go down. No, they do go down, right? We see a lot more multi-cloud. I also feel like some teams at the application team level sometimes think that what they're getting out of going cloud native, going containerized, and to a certain extent self-hosted within the cluster anyway, even if the platform is managed, that they feel like they're getting portability and less lock into a single cloud. If my application runs in one Kubernetes, I can probably get it to run in another Kubernetes with less overall size of a port than if I designed it for, let's say, straight cloud VM traditional style of architecture. And I think that kind of speaks to the reason that we're all doing this in the first place, right? Which is the automation is supposed to help us. This huge amount of automation adds complexity, but it's supposed to help us by automating away stuff that we used to have to do manually, by allowing us to run more bigger clusters and more workloads and manage them in a more effective way. Again, you still need to measure, is it working? For which I recommend that you set some goals and quantitatively measure the goals. But let's keep in mind that the whole reason we're doing this is to get that automation, and it's a huge windfall, right? I don't think anyone here can probably contradict that. It can be a huge windfall if you get it right.
All right. Well, the getting it right is the hard part. So, Frank, you cannot walk down the street these days without somebody leaping out at you and telling you about their new great AI thing. So will machine learning algorithms and who knows, maybe generative stuff or whatever save us from ourselves here? And, we won't have to think about all this because it's kind of hard. So maybe the machines will figure it out for us.
Potentially, but I think, the first, major use case we're going to see out of the AI models and machine learning when it comes to technology as complex as this, as being assistive, either to troubleshooting or to tech support or even modeling use cases. And I think that's where we're going to really see AI come into the mix. Now, of course, that's not to say that people can't develop it that much further to be able to identify particular trends when it comes down to how your clusters are performing or what applications are doing what, and have it become the canary in the mind. But there's still a lot to be done on the AI front when it comes to fully taking over the management and troubleshooting of a complex application, but it surely can be a really good assistant for somebody.
Mm-hmm. All right. Danielle, there's a question here that kind of goes to the heart of some of what we've been talking about, but it says, managed K8s keeps pushing you to upgrade quick, although it doesn't give product or functional benefit. So the question becomes, do we need a long-term release version of Kubernetes? It sure is the case in almost every other open source project where there's something that everybody kind of stable or standardizes on to run stable. In the land of Kubernetes, they're like, theoretically at least, if you're more than 3 releases out, you're like behind, and everybody's 3 releases out. So maybe we should just come to some reality here.
I mean, we advise people, when the latest version of Kubernetes comes out, you don't migrate immediately. Like you need to, we need to see what's happening. You need to check check all of the things, right? See how it's running. So I think, if there's a new version that comes out and you immediately move on to it, like you are probably putting yourself at risk. Like it is open source. It is a community of people who are pushing Kubernetes and changing it. So, making sure that you're not, on 1.1 is a really good thing. But, staying with the latest version immediately when it comes out is probably not advisable either.
All right. Mustafa, what do you think? Do we need a formal long-term release or because it seems like the resistance factor is really high?
So in terms of the Kubernetes versions, as Daniel mentioned, usually you give it some time. For some organizations, that's 3 months until the release after the 1+1 comes, or it could be 6 months. But let's not forget Kubernetes is open source software, and almost always an open source software, you want to be in the latest and greatest, for lots of security vulnerabilities are resolved in the latest version. Of course, you want to do your testing, maybe in a pre-production environment, and figure out what's working for you and what's not. But eventually, you're going to upgrade at some point. Otherwise, you're going to have an unsupported environment.
All right. I think I need a knob that says somewhere between the older version that I don't want to break my app and the security vulnerabilities. Tell me which one of those two is the trade-off of the risk of the day, and I'll land in the middle of that. I think we just need a little applet that does that. It'll be great. Frank, there's a suggestion here from the audience that says one way to reduce all this overhead and complexity, I mean, they used all the 5 words, but I think this is what they're after, is to use the lighter weight versions of Kubernetes and not get involved in all this heavyweight stuff and just use something like K3S or whatever, where basically it's, here's the bits of Kubernetes you need to run stuff at the edge, or maybe you just put a bunch of these lightweight Kubernetes in a stack of servers somewhere and skip all the hard stuff.
Well, when it comes down to doing something like that, yeah, that's great, using the simplest way and these little bits and pieces to make it work. But what happens when you want to start scaling or adding more features, or going a bit deeper into what, containerization can truly offer you from a cloud perspective? You're inherently limiting yourself. You're taking this simple approach, and you're building a brick wall that you get to very quickly once you realize what containerization can do for you and clusters can do for you. And that's where the challenge is. You can build this simple solution to meet your needs of today, but you're not taking into account your needs of tomorrow.
Danielle, what are you seeing? Are people picking up the lightweight distributions of Kubernetes, or they're just going whole hog?
Again, it varies, but I think a lot of the enterprises, it's whole hog. It's like, let's create this platform. Like, let's get developers using it. Let's use all the benefits of it. I think that the challenge, and we talked a little bit about earlier, is developers are going to use it, but are they configuring it correctly? Are there misconfigurations happening? Like, how are you making sure that that's not a problem as you try this out and this new part and this add-on? And so looking for ways where you can identify where there are problems easily, automating that process becomes super important. In any enterprise using Kubernetes.
One thing I wanted to add is, of course, it's kind of obvious, but these lighter version of Kubernetes are typically used at the edge. I had a chance of, talking with a lot of telco customers actually at this last KubeCon last week, and a lot of them actually are thinking of using one of those smaller footprint Kubernetes distributions for their edge locations. So as long as you have some requirements about edge locations and some footprints and restrictions there, I think it's a totally acceptable way to go. But in the sort of the main cluster, the main IT shop, I don't know if you want to limit yourself with a lighter weight distribution and avoid you will have some issues about expanding down the road, like Frank was mentioning. If you don't have the headroom ahead of you in the main center of your deployment, you may have some trouble down the road. But at the edge location is totally fine.
All right, Alex, you were walking down the road one day apparently, and a van pulled up, and you were hijacked into this Kubernetes world. Do I need to have a full kind of DevOps level of maturity to succeed with Kubernetes, or can I be your average IT administrator, or should we really, if you're going to go down this path, have your DevOps house in order?
I think today you do need to have a certain level of maturity around the thing. I guess I would say I do see that organizations adopting Kubernetes do have an education gap they have to fill for their development staff, especially depending on where they're coming from. I am a strong believer in platform engineering, but I don't see that it's entirely necessary to establish the fancy platform engineering ahead of time, partly because I'm watching my customers now successfully operate at many different maturity levels in terms of the platform, provided that their application service owners, have a way of setting goals, have a way of looking at what they're doing. You can add those complexities later. And also, that was my experience adopting it early, like you said, under duress of having a weird workload. It happened to be a video watermarking workload that threw me into that. That was it needed to scale in ways that other platforms at the time weren't handling well for us, and we moved it into Kubernetes. At the beginning, we were pretty immature on the platform side, and yet it worked fine. And I think it's important that you really measure how you're doing. I know I sound maybe like a broken record on that, but I am a strong believer in service level objectives, right? If you set goals and you look at where you're missing those goals and you use a quantitative and careful approach to deciding what to address next, it will guide you through the right stages of that maturity.
Mm-hmm. Mustafa, do you think? Oh, go ahead.
I think what's interesting about that is the cultural journey you have to take people on when you're going cloud native, Kubernetes. And it's one of the things we talk about in the maturity model, that people don't necessarily have all the skills. So when you decide to go cloud native, you need to give them time to skill up. And as you add new users to the platform, it's a journey. It's not an immediate success. And if you don't take the people into account and you don't culturally make sure that they understand why you're moving there, why it meets business objectives, like, people are going to be resistant to it. And that's obviously not a good thing.
Yeah. Mustafa, what do you think of this whole platform engineering trend? And I wonder if Kubernetes will force that issue, to Alex's point, but there are others who would argue that, this is yet another veiled attempt for a centralized IT organization to show up and say, hi, I'm here to help. And, the folks who do DevOps are a little more, independent and maybe departmental level and are not actually looking for a lot of help from the centralized IT team, which from their perspective is kind of roughly equivalent to, hi, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help.
Yeah, great question, Mike. What I have seen with my clients is it depends on their maturity level throughout the journey. So those are just getting started. As Alex pointed out, you don't need a platform team. You just have some certain maturity in DevOps. You don't have to be an elite DevOps organization, but you have infrastructure as code, a way to deploy your apps automatically. A lot of developers and infrastructure team are collaborating, and then eventually, when you have reaching or planning to get to enterprise adoption of cloud or Kubernetes, Kubernetes enterprise adoption, you start to centralize those things because you have to deal with compliance and security. You have to deal with other different business units. I need my own cluster, and you have a whole bunch of hundreds or thousands of clusters across the organization, each with its own configuration and security vulnerabilities and what have you. So at that point, it makes sense to invest in building a platform team to standardize this across the organization.
All right, we got to 47 minutes before somebody mentioned security. So Frank, is security kind of trailing after the fact here? And this is one of the issues that we're not thinking through as far as Kubernetes in the enterprise goes, because we're all gung-ho just to get the clusters up and running, but God forbid there's a misconfiguration and there's a security issue, which seems highly probable.
Right. And, when you look at how Kubernetes is being deployed and how folks are, rapidly pushing it out there, the opportunity to increase the attack surface is there. And, you also look at how quickly Kubernetes is evolving and how quickly, other components that are used in it is evolving. And you come to the conclusion that we're moving so quickly ahead that we're not taking into account how cyber issues are going to impact these applications that have either been developed from scratch or from legacy applications that have been moved into a cluster. And in one respect, this is where that whole DevOps ideology comes back into play, where with DevOps you can implement as part of your continuous integration and deployment pipelines an element of security, DevSecOps, which allows you to make sure the security folks are involved. And it comes down to a lot of it being able to manage the deployments, test the deployments, and look at what potential security issues there are, and not to take it from the point of view of set it and done. You have to continuously look at what potential security impacts there are, especially when you come to, integrating all these other, bits of software into your stack or into your cluster. So I think there's going to be a much bigger focus on security as we move ahead. I think that's actually going to be one of the largest elements as you evolve Kubernetes and K8s in general, and you're going to have an improved security features built in. It actually has to happen.
Maz, do security people know how to spell Kubernetes? I lost Maz's audio. All right. Well, we'll come back to Maz. I don't know what happened there. Danielle, what do you think? Do the security folks know how to spell Kubernetes yet?
Jury's out. I think at large enterprises, they're still very much siloed. So, you have your DevOps teams and they're going, hey, we're going to roll out this Kubernetes thing. Hey, security, by the way, we're doing this. And they're like, whatever, until they're like, wait a second, what are you doing? So, these silos can't happen. And, DevSecOps, is that a reality? Are people really doing it? I don't think it's the majority of people doing it. And I think what needs to happen and what DevOps teams are doing is building in security checks along the way. And they need to be able to show their security teams, here's how we're checking for misconfigurations. Here's how we're making sure we're not, identifying vulnerabilities and fixing them. And there needs to be this compliance evidence of we've done this, we put it in place, and now we can demonstrate it back to you security. But the silo needs to be broken.
Right.
So observability becomes a very important component of all this, so that you can look at these more complex and distributed applications to figure out what's going on before you can maybe even really get deep into the security conversation. I don't know if I'm, just talking off the top of my head here, but I'm curious if people agree on that observability component.
Alex, I think he's talking to you.
Yeah. I mean, look, I would say across our customers, I don't see security as a big blocker to containerization of their applications, even legacy applications. I feel like most of the customers I'm working with have good processes around the thing. In fact, they scan the stuff that we distribute pretty thoroughly. I guess I would say this: it definitely is additional surface. Okay, if you're a security team that's dealing with this, it definitely is additional surface. And one of the things that is, you got to scan more stuff, more images, and more running containers. There's additional ways to get vulnerabilities into your system. But one of the things that I see companies doing is sometimes they are able to constrain that overall attack surface through architecture at the platform level. So one small example, maybe they're looking at Kubernetes ingress and the different ways you can do ingress and all the different mesh type technologies you might use to do that. But what they might do is they might settle on something that's known to them that's pretty simple. So for example, they'll go with, if they're on an Amazon platform, they'll go with an ALB ingress, and they get your standard Amazon, application load balancer with a WAF attached to it. And it's kind of like, okay, we understand that piece. We understand the VPC piece, and that simplifies the degree to which they have to adopt the new technologies all at once. And I see that not only with ingress, but like a lot of the pieces of the system. So I actually consider it probably as kind of a manageable thing. Maybe discounting, there's a huge opportunity for security companies to provide that tooling, right?
Maz, are you back with me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
I can hear you. What do you think?
Yes, audio to dial in for some reason. So on security, I think, the attack surfaces are different. I mean, maybe different in Kubernetes. By definition, it's different type of architecture and model. But basically, the external threats are the same. I mean, there is nothing new about what bad actors want to do or can do or would do on a Kubernetes environment versus a legacy or existing environment. But at the end of the day, you need to protect and have resiliency, right? A business resiliency for not just security purposes, but for outages or other reasons, right? You don't want to have to deal with a ransomware attack if you can have air gaps and backup data to recover from, right? So this is part of example of best practices on a security perspective that you need to have or should have to avoid these kind of issues on the security side. Part of the problem is if you leave areas when you're vulnerable, it's just a matter of time that somebody's going to find a way to get there. So you want to make sure that you have always an insurance policy of some kind to be able to recover from any outage, be it security related or not.
All right, Danielle, you want to jump in here for a minute? Because we have a comment here in the Q&A where basically in the chat session, and somebody is saying, Kubernetes people don't want to know about security. It's somebody else's problem.
I mean, it's not somebody else's problem. That's the problem, because when you are setting it up, it's not secure by default. And if you just, over provision your containers, if you don't set certain configurations in place, like that's the basics. And unfortunately, you can have all these other tools in place to secure your environment, but if you don't, provision correctly with the right permissions and set that up, like you're opening yourself up to a breach. So it's, we keep asking developers to do more and more and more and more, but this configuring Kubernetes correctly, it's important for security.
All right. Mustafa, close us out on this conversation. Do you think Kubernetes folks care about security, or are they just kind of winging it and hoping for the best? And it seems like everybody wants to shift something left and everybody wants to shift right, which is kind of the equivalent of, I don't want it, you can have it. It's too hard for me. What's going on?
I think they do care a lot about security. They just need the guidance and the tools and education. Today, there are a plethora of tools to help teams, for example, build golden images and just common sense containerization things like don't run your container as root, those type of things. If you educate team and guide them through those principles, for example, the CNCF has a white paper on security, pretty much they update it every year or so. That's a great starting point. And start with your image for container image, and then go to the cluster, and then to your code, and then cloud. We call them the 4 C's of cloud native security. If you kind of educate the Kubernetes team of those things and show them here are the tools you can use, open source or commercial, they are willing to follow those things and follow those security best practices to build secure platforms and applications.
All right, and I will give a tip of the hat to one of our attendees who says common sense is the least common thing that exists. If you were managing Kubernetes pretty much the same way you managed every other platform, things are going to end badly. It's almost guaranteed. All right, I want to thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge and insights. Also, I want to point out that there is a handout section up on the top right-hand corner of your screen. There is some collateral up there that will help you in your future adventures that we pulled together and aggregated through our kind folks who are participating here. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Cody.
All right. Thank you, Mike. And to the rest of our panel, thank you so much for being here as well. I feel like I'm taking a whole lot away from this jam-packed conversation. So I would like to remind our audience that this session was recorded. Should you want to rewatch this, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand. And of course, you can find this living on the Cloud Native Now website at cloudnativenow.com/webinars. And be sure to look in the on-demand section. It will be there waiting for you. The 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Palash B, Monique L, Haiti L, and Matthew C. To our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your email inbox to claim your gift card. It should make its way over to you in the next 48 hours, but if you don't happen to see that, check your spam folder just in case it gets filtered out. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I know we've had an action-packed hour, and we really appreciate you staying with us from cover to cover. We do just want to ask for one extra moment of your time to fill out a brief survey that should pop up on your screen as soon as we close out. We'd really like to hear what you thought about our conversation today, or if you have suggestions for topics in the future, go ahead and let us know. Either way, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day. And to our panel, thank you all so much.
Thanks, guys.